Job. I titled this Faith Under Pressure. And I want to read this to you. Natural diamonds are formed about 100 miles beneath the Earth's surface, where carbon-rich rocks are melted by the heat of the Earth's mantle. A layer of liquid lava rock are compressed by the enormous pressure of many miles of earth above them. Diamonds are formed when the conditions are just right. And so we have this precious element when it sits in great heat and intense pressure. I also found that man-made diamonds are created by putting graphite and carbon mixed together with a small seed diamond under extreme pressure. The machines pressurize the core to over 800,000 pounds per square inch and heat it to over 1,000 degrees. And then this is the worst part. After several days, a diamond is created. And, the book of Job is kind of illustrated in that. Faith under pressure. The person that God is making Job into is a person that had to walk through the fires and sit under intense pressure for several days, for quite some time, as God would be transforming this man into the person that he wanted him to be. Now, as we move in here to the book of Job, we have to understand that we're transitioning into another section of our Bible. The first 5 books of our Bible are called the Pentateuch, or the Law. The next 12 books are historical in nature, and they cover the history of the nation of Israel within the Promised Land, removed from the Promised Land, and coming back. Now, as we step into Job, we step into a section that has 5 books in it. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. And it's the poetic section of the Old Testament. Now, these poetic books, they all find their place somewhere within the first 17 books. So the remainder of our Old Testament, we have 16 more books to cover, counting Job, and each of those will fit somewhere in the first 17 books. These books are, again, they're poetic in nature, and a large section of the Old Testament, as you can see, is this poetry. Now, the poetry that we're introduced to at first in school, and some of us never get past, is the poetry of simple rhyme, right? Roses are red, violets are blue, you took the last brownie and I'm angry at you, And so we have this real simple sort of rhyme, rhythmic thing. The Hebrew poetry is different than that, and it doesn't work on this same rhythmic meter, nor is it based upon rhyme, but it's based upon parallelism. And what happens in the Hebrew poetry is ideas are put up against one another, either to parallel and show the similarities or to contrast one another. And so we'll see that particularly as we get into the Psalms. Now, of these poetic books, Job comes first. And the reason for that is that Job took place first. Job has its setting somewhere in the earliest chapters of the book of Genesis. Somewhere after the fall, somewhere probably, even perhaps before, after the flood, but somewhere before the time of Abraham, probably. This is a book that dates way back. In fact, that makes this book some 4,000 years old. It makes it the oldest book in human history. So one of the things that I think we fail to realize sometimes is what we're actually holding in our hands here. What this actually is. I mean, obviously we recognize that this is the inspired Word of God. But we have to also recognize that this book is ancient in nature. Its most recent scribbles, its most recent marks are close to 2,000 years old. This book, for including Job, dating all the way back to him, this book for 4,000 years has been what guided mankind to follow the ways of God. That's what you're holding in your hand. It's the most amazing thing in the entire world. And you carry it around with you. Some of you pull it up on your phone app. This is the Word of God, but it's so amazing in nature. Now, this ancient book, this book of Job, there's evidence to believe that it was written during the time of or Abraham or around that time. And the evidences are things that are omitted. There is no mention of the nation of Israel. There is no mention of the patriarchs. There is no mention of the tabernacle. There is no mention of the law. There is no mention of the priest system. And so we recognize that it predates that. Also, there are two interesting creatures that are referred to by God in the final chapters, in the closing chapters of the book. And as these creatures are described, it's very clear that we are referring to animals that no longer walk this planet. What their description of fits very well when you're walking in the Natural History Museum and you're in the dinosaur section. Okay, and so these two creatures, one is a sea creature, one is a land creature, in the final chapters of the book, and God is referring to them and to Job. And so these are dating back to a time when both dinosaurs and man were walking the earth. Okay, now, while the evolutionary theory removes dinosaurs and man millions of years apart from one another, there is striking evidence to put man and dinosaurs on the planet together. There are cave drawings that have been found where there are different animals, including dinosaurs, that were drawn. There are ancient writings that include references to these giant creatures, including the oldest book in human history, the book of Job. The problem is that because the Bible is the Bible, anything that's recorded in it by secular scholars is immediately removed as not something that we can trust in. And it's not until other sources are found to support it that then they'll give any credence to the Bible. The thing is it's constantly being supported by outside sources. So this is an ancient book. That's why it comes first. Now, in case you're interested, Job contains 10,102 words. If you read it through a couple times this week, that would be 20,204 words. It's divided into 42 chapters. There are 1,070 verses. Job gets its name from its main character. And his name was a very common name at that time. And Job tells the story of a man who is enduring great difficulty and seeking to find answers from God. And so I think it's a story that we can all relate to. The main characters of the story are found in two different scenes. One scene will take place in heaven, and we are introduced to the main characters being God and the devil. Another scene takes place on earth, and we're introduced to these 5 other characters, Job, Eliphaz, Zophar, Bildad, and Elihu. And there is a dialogue that takes place between these guys. In this book, we end up having the privilege of listening to the most learned men of the day trying to explain the problem of suffering. In fact, the main theme of the book of Job is just that, the problem of suffering. Why is it that bad things happen to good people? And the one thing that all of these guys have in common, Eliphaz, Zophar, Bildad, Elihu, even Job himself, as they're talking about the subject of suffering, is that they are all philosophizing in the dark. Okay? They would fit into that category of what Jesus called the blind leading the blind. In fact, note the screen if you will. This is Job 38:2. This is where God speaks. This is his commentary on all of the words of Job and these 4 other characters. He said this, "Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" That's God's. So all the things that these guys say, chapter 3 through chapter 37, as they're trying to answer the question of suffering in the world, God's commentary on all of their philosophy is this: who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? In other words, God says, you don't know what you're talking about. You're confused. Okay? And these guys speak out of that confusion. We're going to see clearly in this book that you can't understand life apart from the revelation of God. That we can't understand the purpose of why we're here. We can't understand where we're heading without revelation from God. And these 5 men, they are going to exchange dialogue. They are going to develop sermons. They're going to wax philosophical. And they're going to do all of it without divine revelation. They are blind to the counsel that took place in heaven in the first 2 chapters. And so everything that they say to Job, they don't know what they're talking about. And everything that Job says, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Now, there are some great promises tucked away throughout the book, but you have to be very careful as to the context in which they're given. Now, one of the key lessons to take away when we're done tonight, one of the key takeaways, when you want to put it in your pocket to remember, is that God withholds the reason for Job's suffering. If you read the book of Job, you read the first 2 chapters, you see what happens to Job. You struggle through the 34 chapters, if I do the math right. You struggle through these chapters of these guys speaking without knowledge, and then you finally come in the 38th chapter to where, I didn't do the math right. You finally come to the 38th chapter where Job hears from God, and what you're longing for is for God to explain to Job why it is that he's suffering. And the fact of the matter is God doesn't do that. He doesn't explain himself. And so one of the things that we have to understand, one of the things that we have to walk away with, is that we're not always going to get an answer for the difficult things that we face. We're not always going to find that. In fact, if you came here tonight in hopes of understanding why you're suffering, I don't think you're going to be disappointed, but I do think that you're going to be redirected. A lot of the purposes of God will not be revealed until we see Him face to face. The Bible says that right now we see dimly. We see as though we're looking through a stained glass. I remember as a kid growing up in the 70s, and stained glass was real popular on front door windows in Southern California. And I can remember going over to a friend's house and knocking on the door and peering through the stained glass, and it's all bizarre, and the shape's on the other side, and you see this mammoth creature coming towards me, knocking on the door like, oh no, who is this? What's going on? There's a behemoth in the house, and opens the door, and a little sister walks up, and it's just the image is so marred by the stained glass. And we look at God that way, and really, guys, we look at life that way. We don't understand things because we look at them with such temporal vision, such limited capacities. Another critical lesson within the book of Job, another important takeaway, beyond the fact that you're not going to get all the answers you're hoping for, is that blessings flow out of suffering. Blessings come out of suffering. God will take us through challenges in order to bring about His purposes in our life. God has a plan for our life, but that plan includes us going through some difficult waters in order for it to be accomplished. In fact, if you note the screen, this is Hebrews 12:11. It says this, "Now no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful." That might be one of the greatest understatements ever written, right? You say, yeah, this doesn't seem super joyful, but it is painful. We go through those times. He says this, "Nevertheless, afterward," there's a purpose. "Afterward, it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been," what's that? Trained by it. God is putting us through that test. And one of the things that we see as we go through the book of Job is that the only way that we'll understand the suffering that we're going through is when we see it in light of eternity. We can't just see it in light of time. This story of Job ends, and it's an interesting ending because at the very end, God restores to Job. And we're told that Job gets double what he had before. And, if you're looking at the first part, well, he loses his houses. And you go, okay, double houses. That's awesome. And he loses all his livestock, his business. Double business. Awesome. But we also realize Job lost his family. His kids all died. And you go, can you really replace that? And so some, as we read the book, we go, well, I don't really get this, because how is it, his kids were taken away from him. His kids died, and so he gets replacement kids. That's not really the same thing. You see, we're only seeing it from the perspective of time. We're not seeing it from the perspective of eternity. Were his kids gone? No. Did he lose his kids? No, he knew right where they were. In fact, it may be the only time in life he ever knew right where they were. See parents around here. I'm not going to pick specifically on any particular parents, but one of the dads here who has 7 kids, and I've seen his kids after church when everyone else is gone, and I'll go, hey, what's going on? My dad forgot me, left, and it's like that. You just when you have more than you can count on one hand, it's easy to lose them. And so, not sure exactly where they are. Job didn't lose his kids. He knew where they were. They're in eternity. They're waiting for him. He's going to see them again. He's going to be with them again. But you see, we can't understand suffering without stepping out of time and looking at it through the eyes of eternity. It's then that we understand it. And suffering leads to blessing, but we're not always going to experience that now. Sometimes we're going to have to wait to eternity to understand it. Now, why should we study this book? Let me give you a couple of answers. Number one, I think the most common reason would be that this is a subject that is near, though not very dear, to any of us, and that is suffering. All of us face things that are bigger than ourselves. All of us face things that cause us to even question the ways of God. It's important to remember that Job did not get an answer, and here's why. Pay attention to this. This is critical. Job did not get an answer because God is the answer. You see, why did this happen to me? And God doesn't say, well, this happened to you because of X, Y, Z. He doesn't tell him that. But at the end of the story, Job has an encounter with God. Job finds himself face to face with God. In fact, it's on the screen. Job chapter 42, verses 5 and 6. Do we have that one? Did I remember to give you that one? Awesome. He says, Job is responding to God. Last chapter of the book, I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear. Hey, I heard of you. I listened to Bible studies. I heard things about you, God. He says this, but now my eye sees you. He has an encounter with God. Next verse says this, therefore I abhor myself and I repent in dust and ashes. Job comes to the end of himself. He was brought to the end of himself that he might find God. And the wonderful thing, guys, is that at the end of ourselves, we can always find God. When we come to that place where we break, when we come to that place where it's too much and we collapse, God is there. You know, there's a verse, Jesus said this. He said, fall on the rock and be broken. Who wants to sign up for that? Fall on the rock and be broken. You go, nope, not interested. Until he gives option B. Have the rock fall on you and be ground to powder. And you say, A. I choose number one. like if those are the two. Like I'm thinking, Jesus, a third choice would be awesome. How about lay out on the rock and tan? Okay? He says you have two choices. Either be broken or be crushed, right? There is a process that the Lord wants to bring us through. It's a process whereby he breaks us. It's a process whereby he brings us to the end of ourself. Because at the end of ourself, we're face to face with him. I want to read to you the words of one man. He said this, in the book of Job, we see the death of the self-life. Job is brought to the end of himself. He sees himself as God sees him. The man who at first is said to have been the best man on earth is found at last on his face before God, exclaiming, I abhor myself in dust and ashes. Job was brought to the end of himself, and we need to come there. It's at the end of ourself that we find God. Number two, second reason to study the book of Job illustrates for us the way the devil works. Paul wrote and said this. He said that we are not ignorant of Satan's devices. Okay, the surest way to have victory in the spiritual battle that we face is to understand our enemy. One of the reasons that Satan is so good at tripping us up is because he understands his enemy. Understand? He understands us. He knows the things that trip us up. He watches, he knows, and so he's able to easily tempt us. And it's important that we understand his ways. And here in the book of Job, we see the way the enemy works in the first chapter. We'll look at it closely in a minute. But we see, first of all, in chapter 1, we see God and Satan having exchange. They're talking. And God says this. He says to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And actually, first he says, "Where have you been?" to Satan. And Satan says, "Well, I've been walking to and fro across the earth." He says, "Have you considered my servant Job? He's a righteous man. He fears me. He's upright in all of his ways." And then Job says, "Well, he only does that because you're good to him." And we see two things there on how the devil works. Number one, we see that the devil goes about like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. He's going to and fro across the earth. That word "consider" is a word that means to size up. He sizes up. That's what the enemy's doing. He's traveling around, sizing up, looking at whom he may devour. That's what he does. Number two, so is he's going out seeking to devour. Number two is God says, "Hey, have you checked out my servant Job?" And I think, don't point me out. Don't point me out. I when I was in high school, I had this German class, and my brother was in the class, and my brother was a whole lot more scholastic than I was. And so since we were both in the class, I figured there's no real need. If you're in high school, you need to this is not a good example, okay? I'm just using it as an example, not as a good one, okay? So don't follow this example. I'm just telling you that this is what I did. I wasn't saved. But I figured we were both in the class. There wasn't a real need for both of us to do the homework. And since my brother was going to do it anyway, I saw no real need for me to do it. And so I sat in the class, and I sat behind one of the linemen for the high school football team. And I wasn't the strapping guy that I am today. I was small in high school. And so I sat in the last row. My brother sat in the row next to me, 3 seats up, and we would come down, the teacher would just come down the row asking the different questions on the last night's homework, and people would answer. And as she came to the guy, a couple of people in front of me, I would just lean forward and just kind of do this. And that lineman, he was so big that he just kind of overshadowed me. And I would just sneak down like this, and she would end up skipping me and going to the next person. I'd wait 2 people or so, and then I'd lean back up. And I could avoid getting picked on. If I did get picked on, then I would walk by my brother's desk and pick up his notebook and go to the board to do it. So, I think as God's up there and he's saying, "Hey, have you considered my servant Jim?" I'd kind of be going like this, kind of be ducking behind Kevin or something, just sitting back going, trying to hide. And that didn't work for Job. God pointed him out. And what does Satan do? He said, "He only serves you because you're good to him. Take away his stuff and he'll curse you to your face." We find Satan doing what Satan does. Not only does he seek to devour, but he also accuses the brethren. In fact, the book of Revelation, we'll see when we get into chapter 12, that's what he's called, the accuser of the brethren. Do you know that the name Satan means slanderer? That's what he does. He slanders your name before God. But you know what else we learn about Satan? We learn that his boundaries are limited by God. We learn that he can only do what God allows him to do. When Satan wants to do something to Job, God puts specific parameters around him. He says, "You can do this, you cannot do any more." And so we see the ways of Satan, but we see that they're controlled by the Lord. Another reason to study the book is that it teaches us about the ways of God. And one of the things that we learn very clearly is that the ways of God are above the ways of man. At the exchange at the close of the book, chapters 38 through the end, as Job and God are having this dialogue, as they're talking together, Job, I think, as you and I, the reader, is wishing that God will give him sort of resolution. Why is this happening? Why am I going through this? And instead, what God does is he points out that Job and God are very different from one another. He asks them a series of questions, starting with, where were you when I created the earth? Like, were you with me? You weren't there. And then he talks about how God personally talks about how he holds the world together. And he asks Job if he has the capacity to do that. And then he takes Job through a series of different created beings, and he points out certain traits about them, certain things about them. One that stands out is the ostrich. And God talks about how stupid it is. Okay? He says they're fast and they're beautiful, but they're dumb. Okay? And God says, I made them that way. They're that way because I created them that way. And what he's doing in this is he's doing two things. One is he's showing Job how vast and superior God is to man. But secondly, he's saying this, Job, I made man with certain capacities. I made man. I created him. And man has limited capacities. And part of that is that we cannot understand the vastness of the ways of God. His ways are above us. And so there are certain things that we can't find resolution to because they're simply beyond us. Now, we don't like that. In fact, perhaps we like the evolutionary theory a little bit better, that we're the top of the food chain. We like the idea that we're the best. We're the superior species. There's nothing above us, and we can comprehend everything that there is to comprehend. But the sheer fact of the matter is that's not true. We are created by God, and we have limited capacities. And God is so far above us that we can't completely understand his ways. And as we go through the book of Job, we find that. Finally, last reason to study before we get into our outline. The book of Job is a wonderful lesson in forgiveness. It's a great lesson in forgiveness. Job was a man of prominence. We're told that he was a very wealthy man. We're told he was from the land of Uz. We don't know where Uz was, but we do know that wherever it was, Job was the greatest guy in Uz. He was the wealthiest man in the whole area. We know that he was a godly man. We read in the first chapter of Job spending time praying, spending time offering sacrifice. We know he was a loving man. He cared for his kids. He was involved in their lives. So here we have this godly man, this loving man, this caring man, this wealthy, successful, honored man, and he loses everything. His portfolio was quite diverse, and yet when things crashed, he lost everything. His entire wealth was stripped from him. In addition, his family. He lost all of his children, and shortly thereafter, his wife, though still alive, turns on him. He lost his health. He suffers unimaginable horror with this physical pain that he goes through. He lost his extended family. They're nowhere to be seen in his time of greatest need. He lost his friends. They wanted nothing to do with him. In fact, it's interesting. Satan had been hunting, right? He's going about like that lion. He's hunting. He finds Job. God pointed him out. And he finds Job, and he goes after Job full force with everything God will allow him to do. And at the end, Job doesn't sin. Job doesn't sin. In fact, he celebrates. In fact, he worships in a way that's just amazing. He turns to his wife when his wife says, "Curse God and die," and he says, "How can we take difficulty from the Lord and when we take blessing from, not take difficulty when we take blessing from Him? How can we do that?" He's just this man of great faith. All Satan's attack, he doesn't sin. But you know what? In a few conversations with his friends, they can get him to sin. His buddies can get him to do what the devil couldn't get him to do. Job ends up accusing God of wrongdoing as the book continues because his friends had turned on him. This guy lost everything. But at the end of the story, we find Job forgiving his friends and restoring relationship with them. If we can bring up that verse in chapter 42, verse 10, it says this, the Lord restored Job's losses, look at that next phrase, when he prayed for his friends. Isn't that awesome? Job had no idea that God was going to restore him. God never made that promise to him. Job lost everything. He was suffering physically. He has this encounter with God. He falls before God and he says, I just abhor myself, Lord. I'm a sinner and I'm wrong. And everything that I thought about you, I'm seeing differently now in light of who you are, in light of how majestic and holy and amazing you are. And he just falls before the Lord. And then there before the Lord, apparently he begins to pray. And what he prays for is his friends. He prays for them. And as he prays for them, God restores him. His health is restored. His wealth is restored. His extended family that left him is restored. His wife is restored. His friendships are restored. And he goes on to have children that are added to the children that are waiting for him in heaven that he's with now. It's all restored to him when he prayed. You know, David Gusick, I think it was, made the statement at our men's conference. He said, harboring bitterness is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. You know, if you're holding on to something, if you're holding on to some grudge, something where someone has done something wrong to you and you won't let it go. I'm not letting this go. This is the fourth time this happened and I'm not going to let it go. It's not happening, and you're holding on to that. Remember, it was when Job prayed that God restored. It's a great blessing that God wants to pour out on our life when we're willing to forgive. And I think there are times when we miss out on the blessings of God in our life simply because we're holding on to something that God long ago wanted us to let go of. Now, that being said, let's walk through the book quickly. The book can be divided into 3 parts. Real simply, the parts are this: prologue, dialogue, epilogue. Okay? So real simple. Prologue, chapters 1 and 2. Chapters 1 and 2 form this prologue. Now the word prologue, not used in the book, but the word prologue, it's a Greek word. It's actually a compound word. The prefix, pro or before, and the log is a very well-known biblical Greek word. It's the word logos, or the word for word. And it means simply a word beforehand. You know, what happens in the first 2 chapters is we're given some insight that if you miss that, you will never understand the rest of the book. The book will be a complete mystery to you without the first 2 chapters. God says, listen, for the reader's sake. Now remember, Job doesn't get to know this. Job doesn't get to read chapters 1 and 2 before the end of chapter 2 happens. You understand? He doesn't get that. We do. We get this insight. You know, sometimes you sit down, you're watching a movie together with the family, and somebody shows up late. They miss the beginning. They miss the scene that sort of explains the whole thing. Everything stems out of that. And what happens? They annoy you for an hour and a half. Why are they doing that? Who's that person? I don't know what's going on. Okay? Well, God gives us insight here into what's happening by taking us to these first couple chapters. Now, they take place on 2 realms. At first, it's earth. In earth, we're introduced, chapter 1, verse 1. There was a man from the land of Uz, whose name was Job. He was blameless and upright, who feared God and shunned evil. 7 sons, 3 daughters were born to him. Also, his possessions were 7,000 sheep, and goes on to list this whole wealth that he has, the greatest man in the east. Verse 4, his sons would go feast in their houses, each on their appointed day, and would send and invite the 3 sisters, and they'd eat and drink with them. So they had this wonderful family unit. They all liked each other. So it was when the days of feasting had run their course that Job would send and sanctify them, and would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them. For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did regularly. So here's, this beautiful family, and Job loving the Lord, leading his family. We're introduced to him. But then we jump to a scene in heaven. We leave earth. Job doesn't know that this is what's happening in the realm of the spirit while these things are happening on earth. And verse 6 says, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also. So we see that Satan was called before the throne of God. And this is where he says, where have you been? And I've been touring around the earth, hunting people down. And Satan says, verse 9, does Job fear you for nothing? Have you made a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? You might want to mark that phrase, because the answer to that question is yes. And it's the same for you and I. Has God put a hedge about you and your family? The answer is yes. If you're a believer in Jesus Christ, there's a hedge about you. There's a hedge about your family. There's a sanctification that's in your home. God has his hedge about you. God has his protection on you. Now, we're going to see here that God, lets Satan's chain loose a little bit onto Job in a way that perhaps we don't like. But he says he can stretch out his hand upon Job, take his possessions, take his family, but can't touch his body. And then we go back to earth. And in earth, we read that in verses 13 through really the end of the chapter, we read about these guys that come and report to Job. Said, hey man, these raiders came, attacked, and killed all your kids and took all your stuff. And then this fire from heaven came and devoured your crops and killed your family. And then there was this tornado that hit, and a bunch of people died, and your stuff was destroyed. And Job falls on his face, verse 21. It says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. What an incredible response. Let me ask you this. How do you respond when tragedy hits? How do you respond when the whirlwind hits and takes something away? How do you respond when the fire comes down and takes something away? How do you respond when the raiders come and take something away? How do you respond? Job fell on his face and worshiped and said, blessed be the name of the Lord. Now, how did he do that? He did that because on the days leading up to this, Job feared God and shunned evil and spent time in prayer and sacrifice. You understand? This is not a difficult concept. I'm sure you can grasp it. Okay? If you have a bank account, and if weekly you are putting funds into that bank account, then when something breaks at home, you can take out of that bank account and you can pay to fix it, right? If you don't put anything into that bank account, then when something breaks at home, you don't have anything to draw from. Do you understand that? I didn't want this to be a finance class, but you do understand that, right? like that's basic finance. If you don't have that money in the account, you can't draw from it. And some of us have a spiritual account that we are not making deposits in. We're not investing in that. We're not taking the time to daily be in the Word. Some of you have been making some serious investments of late in your spiritual account. You've been in the Word. You've been in worship. You've been in study. You've been in fellowship groups, and you've been making those investments. Listen, those investments are what you will be able to draw from when things get difficult. Job wasn't made out of different mud than you and I are made out of, and that's why he was able to, with this tragedy, just say, bless God. God, you're on the throne. It was because he'd been making those investments in his life. Now the scene goes back to heaven in chapter 2, and there's again this dialogue, and God says again, hey, did you see Job? He didn't curse me. And Satan says, well, that's because he has his health. If you let me take his health, he'll curse you to your face. And so God again puts parameters on Satan, and Satan goes out. And we're told in verse 7, Satan went out from the presence of the Lord, struck Job with painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took for himself a potsherd, which is broken pottery, with which to scrape himself while he sat in the midst of ashes. That's just horrible. There's no way around that. He's in this horrible condition. His wife says to him, do you hold fast to your integrity, curse God and die? But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. So I don't know if that's really how you want to communicate with your wife, men. That's probably, that's not marriage 101 right there, but she started it. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity. And in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Now, at this point, we have a transition, and we're introduced at the end to the three friends of Job. There's a fourth guy that shows up later. Don't know if he's a friend of his or just a guy who wants to share his opinion on the matter. But we're introduced to these guys. Verse 11 tells us there's Eliphaz, the Temanite, and then this next character, apparently someone of diminutive stature, Bildad the Shuhite. So, and then Zophar. Some of you guys are going, wait, I missed it. Okay, he's the second shortest, or I guess second shortest guy in the Bible. The third shortest guy in the Bible is Nehemiah. Then there's Bildad the Shuhite, and then there was one guy that fell asleep on a watch. So apparently he was really small. But so these guys came and met with Job, and they sat for a week. And for a week, these three characters just sat, and there was no talking. And Job just in his agony, they just watched him, and Job just suffering. And then finally, after a week of this, Job speaks. And then that really begins this dialogue. And from chapter 3 through chapter 37, there's this exchange. Job and each of these characters. And Job will speak, and one of them will respond, and Job will respond, and then one of them. And it goes through these chapters. Okay, so we're not going to look at all the details. This is stuff for you to read on your own. This is a cursory view of the book. But I do want you to see a couple of things that I think are very, very important as we look through this dialogue. And that is that each one of these guys is going to seek to explain why Job is suffering, beginning with Job. Okay? Job is going to speak. And each of them is going to speak from a different sort of perspective. You know, we all see life from a different perspective. And Job is going to speak. He's in this condition of suffering, and he's going to speak regarding his suffering. And Job will speak with the voice of pain. And we understand that pain speaks, doesn't it? Okay, we understand that, you know, a lot of times when someone is hurt and they'll voice something, and we have to realize it's, you know, this is not really them. They're not angry at you. They're not just a vindictive person. They're hurting. They're speaking out of pain. And Job speaks out of his pain. And he's an example at some times of heroic faith. I mean, he says at one point, though God slay me, yet I will trust him. That's awesome. Like, you know, you put that down. That's a great verse. You know, what a wonderful thing. You know, he says, you know, blessed be the name of the Lord when he loses everything. At times he has great faith. At other times he speaks out of total weakness. And so Job is a character we can relate to, because in all of our lives we have moments of heroic faith, and we also have moments of great weakness. And in Job's great weakness, he speaks with the voice of pain. And essentially what Job says is that he would be better dead. Then he's not satisfied with that. Job goes on and he says, you know what? It would be better if the day that I was born never existed. If we could go back and we could just remove that day completely from the face of the earth, that I had never, ever existed, then things would be better. Have you ever had a pity party? Like, this guy goes all out, right? I mean, there's some show, and I've only, you know, cursed over it, but there's some show where it shows these elaborate, you know, parties that wealthy people throw for their children. They've got like an 8-year-old, and they spend $30,000 on a party. Okay, Job had one of those pity parties, like the most immense pity party of all time, and he's thinking life would be better if I never ever walked the face of the earth. But understand, Job's speaking with the voice of pain. Those aren't true statements. In fact, everything that Job says about death, he's wrong. So when you read chapter 3 and you read what Job has to say about death, understand this. He's speaking from the perspective of having never been there. He doesn't know what it's like. Pain is affecting his viewpoint. Number 2, we come to this guy Eliphaz. And Eliphaz speaks on 3 different occasions through the book. And he speaks the voice of personal experience. Turn to chapter 4 real quick. This is a classic. Eliphaz, chapter 4, verse 12. Let's read what he has to say. He says, a word was secretly brought to me, and my ear received a whisper. In disquieting thoughts from the vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on men, fear came upon me, and trembling, which made all my bones shake. Then a spirit passed before my face, and the hair on my body stood up. It stood still, but I could not discern its appearance. A form was before my eyes. There was silence. Then I heard a voice saying, "Can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his maker?" Like, what is this guy talking about? He's got this elaborate, super spiritual experience that he has. Ooh, and my hair stood up, and I knew it was God. And I heard this voice. And then he bases everything that he has to say on this experience. Okay? It's the voice of experience. And he tries to explain suffering based upon what he's going through. One of the things that he says, look at verse 7. The voice of experience taught him this. Remember now, here's a question, who ever perished being innocent, or where were the upright ever cut off? Now his message to Job is this. It's the same of all his friends. They say this, Job, you are suffering because there's sin in your life. And if you got the sin out of your life, then your sickness would go away, your money would come back, and maybe your kids would rise from the dead. I don't know. But you know, the sin that's in your life, that was their message to him. And he asked this question. He says, remember now, who ever perished being innocent, or were the upright ever cut off? Well, let's see if we can answer that question. Is there anybody that we can think of that ever perished being innocent, or was upright and cut off? Isn't that the message of the gospel? He who knew no sin became sin for us. You understand, this guy's, his own experience has formed his philosophy, his understanding of God. He can only understand God in light of his experience, and so he misunderstands God. Okay? We come to our third character, Bildad, the Shuhite. He speaks the voice of tradition. Look at what he says, chapter 8. Chapter 8, verse 8. He says this, "For inquire, please," he's speaking to Job, "inquire, please, of the former age, and consider the things discovered by their fathers. For we were born yesterday and know nothing, because our days on earth are a shadow. Will they not teach you and tell you the utter words from their heart?" In other words, the kind of the perspective this guy takes is the perspective of tradition. Like our fathers and their fathers before them, that's how they always saw these things. And so we see the things the way they saw things. Eliphaz, his thinking is really the seeds that form the prosperity doctrine that is so prevalent today. You know, this idea that there's sin in your life, and if you get the sin out of your life, that God's going to bless you, and that you're going to have this great wealth and success and everything else. The seeds of those things come from what Eliphaz has to say. Bildad has a different perspective, and Bildad, as we read him, he's very legalistic, and he has this view of God that God is very harsh and angry, and he gets that from the tradition that's been passed down to him. And then finally, we have this character, Zophar. And Zophar, he speaks with what we might call the voice of enlightenment. And he says over and over again, I know, and I know, and I know, but he never tells us where he knows it. Like, he never tells us where he learned it. And he's very matter of fact about things, and he says, I know this, and I know this, and I know this, but where did you learn that? And he seems to be kind of represent those who, think of themselves as having some sort of enlightenment. They've had some enlightened experience where they can understand things. And the reality is that all three of these guys teach the same message, and that is that suffering is a result of sin, and Job, if you get the sin out of your life, everything is going to go away. Now, let's pause for a moment. Sin does cause suffering. And if you are suffering, it's a good idea to have your first look when something bad happens. Your first look ought to be up. You ought to look to the Lord. Your second look ought to be in. You ought to look and say, okay, is there anything that shouldn't be here? And I ought to deal with myself in light of the Lord. Okay, that's a true statement. But that doesn't mean that suffering is always a result of sin. It doesn't mean that if something bad happens to you, it's because God is unhappy with you. God couldn't have been more pleased with Job. He's bragging about Job to the devil. He points him out above every person on the planet. He loves him. And so this idea that you're suffering just because there's sin in your life, well, if there is sin in your life, deal with it and maybe the suffering will stop. But there may be suffering that is just beyond that. It's a process that God is bringing you through. And listen, the voice of pain or experience or tradition or self-enlightenment cannot give a satisfactory answer to the reason why we suffer. The only way we're going to find that is if we wait to hear God speak. So let's go there. Let's go listen to God speak. Chapter 38. In chapter 38, God speaks. And this is the epilogue, the final part of the book, chapter 38 through 42, and it's just going to bring a conclusion to the story. And these chapters are a conversation between God and Job. And basically, as I mentioned before, Job is told by God that he's not capable of understanding the ways of God, that they're beyond him. And he is brought face to face with the Lord. He comes through this trial and he sees God in a new way. In fact, he sees God in a way that he would never have seen him without the trial. He says, I heard of you before, but now I see you with my eyes. And he falls down before him in worship. And while trials are never something that we look forward to, and trials are not something that we should in arrogant pride say, bring it on, Lord, I'm ready to grow. We'll let God be the one to decide those things, and we'll just walk with him. But God wants to perfect us. But listen, suffering is of no value. There's no value in suffering for suffering's sake. You understand? Like if suffering doesn't bring you to the Lord, where the Lord can do a work in your life, suffering has no value. It just hurts. There's no value. It's not like if I cut my arm, I'm going to be more spiritual. There was a time in history when the church had developed this idea that somehow suffering was a way of growth, that suffering itself. And so there was this idea, it was the monastic era in church history, and people would self-inflict them. They would hit themselves. They would sleep in horrible conditions. They would eat tasteless food. They would suffer in imaginable ways that they brought upon themselves, thinking that suffering would make them holy. That just makes you miserable. There was a guy named Simon. He's referred to as Simon the Stylite. And this guy actually built a pillar, I believe it was 40 feet tall. And he lived on this pillar. He lived up there. And people would come and they'd send him water and they'd send him food, and he lived up on this pillar so that he didn't have to have any contact with human beings, and he suffered out in the sun, out in the heat, suffered because he thought he was making himself holy. He was just making himself foolish. There's no value in that. But when God brings about that difficulty in our life, God is able to bring us to the place where we fall before him, where we break before him, and there God is able to do a work in our life. Last thing, let's close here. Where's Jesus in the book of Job? 3 things, write these down. Number 1, you'll take comfort in the book of Job by knowing how carefully God is watching Job. He knows everything about him. God's looking down. He knows Job's name. He knows his family. He knows the things Job does. He watches him. And you can take comfort in knowing that God watches you. But in Jesus, listen, God doesn't just watch. He visited, didn't he? He came and he tabernacled among us. Write this reference down. Look it up on your own later. Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 and 15. The Bible tells us that Jesus, the Son of God, passed through the heavens to become your high priest. Number 2, where is Jesus in the book of Job? Well, we started our evening with it. Chapter 9, verse 33 and 34. Jesus is that mediator that stands between God and man, puts a hand on holy God and a hand on sinful man and bridges the gap. And listen carefully. The only way to have a right relationship with God, the only way to go to heaven is to accept Jesus the mediator, to walk across that bridge that he is built with his own blood on the cross, and to enter into a relationship with God. And by simply praying and asking Jesus Christ to wash your sins and come into your heart, you enter into a relationship with God. And if you're interested in having that relationship with God, we'll invite you in just a moment as the service ends to come in the front. The pastors will be here to pray with you and for Jesus to come into your life and transform your life. Lastly, let's go to this final verse. Go with me to Job chapter 19. Job 19. I had you turn to 38 and we didn't look at anything because I looked at the clock. Chapter 19, verse 25. I'll start at 23. Job says, "Oh, that my words were written. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book, that they were engraved on a rock with an iron pen and lead forever." Isn't that awesome? He says, man, only if this could be written down and last forever. What did Jesus say about the Word of God? It would last forever. Next verse, verse 25, you can see it on the screen. "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand at last on the earth. And after my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I will see God." Hey, where's Jesus in the book of Job? Jesus is the one that fulfills what Job couldn't have, and that is Jesus visited earth as our high priest. Jesus is in the book of Job as the mediator that Job longed for. And Jesus is in the book of Job as the one that Job looked forward to, the one who's coming back. And there's a day when Jesus is going to come stand on this planet. He's going to make all things right. Guys, it is then that suffering will finally run its course. It's then that all of the pain and all the difficulty that we experience will be in light of eternity when we stand face to face with Jesus Christ.